It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel members, all three of which are sitting to my left. Professor Genevieve Bell. Genevieve is a cultural anthropologist, a technologist, and a futurist, best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology. Genevieve is the Distinguished Professor at the ANU and the Director of the 3A Institute, which she founded in collaboration with Data 61, and is also the inaugural appointee to the Florence Violet Mackenzie Chair at ANU for her work on promoting the inclusive use of technology in society. She's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, the first Engelbert Distinguished Fellow, and appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia. So welcome, Genevieve. Narelle Luchetti is the Head of Division of the Digital Economy and Technology Division in the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. Narelle's responsible for work to do with the digital economy policy, business digital adoption and international digital policy. Narelle's division also supports the growth and productivity of globally competitive businesses by developing and promoting cohesive national digital economy policies and programs. Narelle has spent the last 10 years working across digital policy and IT implementation across Commonwealth agencies. Welcome, Narelle. And Dr. Simon Barry. Welcome, Simon. The Deputy Director of CSIRO's Data 61, with scientific expertise in developing tools and models to transform data into knowledge for informed decision-making and action. In previous roles, Simon led the Environmental and Agricultural Informatics program that researched the various environmental statistical challenges in addition to developing and implementing innovative methodologies capable of producing then the National Land Use Map of Australia during his time in my former department, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. So welcome, Simon. So I'm now going to invite each of our panellists to provide some opening remarks, and then we'll get into questions and answers. So Genevieve, would you like to begin?
I would. Thank you, David, and thank you for that gracious introduction. It's also my pleasure to be here, and I too want to acknowledge the land on which I'm currently sitting, Ngunnawal and Ngambri territory, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that this is land that was never ceded and always sacred, and it's always good to be at home to get to say those things. I wanted to pick up where Alan left off. I think Alan's right to make the claim that we have work to do. I also kind of like that Alan was having a Douglas Adams moment, warmed the cockles of my slightly aged heart to think about deep thought and the number 42 and the question and the answer. But I think where Alan is pointing us is an important one, which is that we actually have work to do to think about what it would be to be a society in which AI could flourish. And Alan talked about the need for trust and for certificates and notions of the golden rule. I actually think you have to push that one step further. One of the things that was really striking to me in the last couple of years in the United States was that people had started to talk about AI-ready companies and that we needed to have an AI-ready organisation. And I want to kind of push on that even further and say I think we need to have an AI-ready society, and that it's not just about the kind of imprimatur around AI, it's all the other pieces that we would need to work on. And to my mind, that actually means there's 6 things we'd need to be paying attention to. One of them is precisely where Alan is pointing us, that we need to have a balanced regulatory framework. So how do we think about where AI comes from, who gets to regulate it, what those regulations should look like? How do we think about ethics as part of a portfolio of standards and policy and legislation and regulation? How would we think about the kind of debates that are unfolding in Australia right now about the relationship between foreign companies, local data, and the complex of technologies and networks that make it very hard to know where those borders precisely sit and how they might get policed, regulated, and imagined. So a well-regulated sort of framework I think we need. I think you have to take that one step further and say whatever it means to imagine an AI-ready society also means to have to think about an engaged society. So how is it that we would tackle issues about trust, but also issues about the stories we tell. How would we think about the role of AI inside civil and civic discourse? How do we imagine the role of AI in the stories that we tell and how those become fact or fiction? How do we think about notions of deepfakes? Now, of course, we know AI didn't create those. We have been telling stories that weren't true for a very long time. AI just allows us to do that at a scale that is hitherto unimaginable. So how was it that we would think about using these technologies to promote civic and civil engagement, not fracture us further? I think there's a third piece of what it would be to be an AI-ready society, which is how do we build out a learning focus? So how is it that we think about continual and continuous in learning, training, skills development, research, that entire portfolio? What does it mean to think about how we will prepare our children, but also our communities and our grown-ups for this world? We spend a lot of time talking about STEM education in primary school and high school and forget that most of Australia is no longer in primary school or high school. So how is it that we want to think about engaging with the necessary skills and building blocks that all of us can be inside that world and know how to ask the right questions? So a regulatory environment, an engaged society, a learning focus. I think we would need to think differently about the rules of our economy. We've spent an inordinately long time thinking that the way that a technology could most be successful in a society was to encourage productivity and efficiency gains. I want to suggest that a well-balanced economy may be more than a single metric. It may be more than the GDP. It may be that we need to think about some different metrics of what a well-balanced society looks like with AI. How would we think about measuring an economy that had a different kind of technology at its core? Because we really are talking about a technological transformation here akin to multiple prior waves of industrialization. So how do we learn some lessons from that past and not reproduce it all over again? I do sometimes think because of that, however, when we talk about technologies, we think the places that we need to most look at them are in the workplace. It's hard not to have a conversation about AI and talk about the future of work. Capital T, capital W, capital F. I'm actually really interested in also talking about the future of the creative sector. How do we think about what the role of AI is in the arts, in sport, in entertainment? What does it mean to think about the role of AI in producing beauty and wonder and the spectacle? There are lots of places we can look at that, and it's certainly a place where Australia has long led the way in terms of how we use new technologies in art, and this is another opportunity. But thinking about AI as though it was solely a tool of productivity and efficiency is, I think, a way to let our own society down. And then last but by no means least, in the list of things I think it would take to be an AI-ready society, is I actually think we have to think about what it means to use AI and sustainability. Alan talked about the notion of data and server farms. What sits underneath of that actually turns out to be an enormous amount of electricity. Storing and circulating and curating the world's data as of 2 years ago cost 10% of the world's energy budget. That's an enormous amount of energy for a single technical infrastructure. What it means to think about building that in the 21st century, particularly in a place like Australia, means we're actually going to have to change some of the ways we imagine that technology being delivered. There are questions we should be asking of its developers and of the people that we partner with to deliver that technology, of how it is that we do it inside an envelope that we can live with in a way that is sustainable and responsible. So that's a lot of things to make an AI-ready society. A framework, a way of thinking about the economy, a way of thinking about education, a way of thinking about citizenship and creativity and the ecology. So what am I doing to help all of that? Because it's one thing to stand here and say, you need to do all of that. It's another thing to think about what is it that one should personally contribute. So I came home 3 years ago now, as David mentioned, to start a new initiative at the Australian National University. I came off spending 20 years in Silicon Valley, and it was very clear to me that AI as a technology was going to change the way we lived in lots of places. And I was acutely aware that in that moment, there weren't that many people who knew how to talk about it, build it, regulate it, design it, make sense of it, decommission it afterwards. There were people who knew how to think about the computational piece of that puzzle, but not what it meant to stick AI inside things. Buildings, the electrical grid, the transportation grid, your office, your home. And I was increasingly wondering who would be the engineers of that new technical revolution, who were going to be the engineers of a cyber-physical or AI-empowered world. And when I looked around the world, there weren't any. And so in the kind of move you can only do if you spend 20 years in Silicon Valley, I squared my shoulders and went, right, I'm going to establish a new branch of engineering. Go. Happily for me, Larry Marshall and Adrian Turner and Brian Schmidt and Eleanor Huntington did not laugh at that proposition. They said, okay, very good, let's go. And so the institute I run, which is now almost ready to start its third year, is committed to one devastatingly simple and slightly ambitious proposition, that we need to establish a new branch of engineering to take AI safely, responsibly and sustainably to scale. No small thing. And we're doing it the ways you might hope someone would build a branch of engineering in the 21st century. We're teaching it into existence, we're researching it into existence, and we're theorizing it into existence. Oh, and because I know my 5 minutes are up, here is my tiny, tiny plug. We're also recruiting students. The last day for admissions is this coming Sunday. So you can find us on the internet at the3ainstitute.org, and please put in an application. Thank you.
Tremendous. Thanks very much, Genevieve.
You're welcome.
You've given us a lot to think about there, which we will come back to. Simon, I might go to you next in terms of your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, David. It's unfortunate to follow Genevieve. Well, it's fortunate in some ways, but I don't think I can quite live up to it. But I think, look, I think the issues around the regulation of this technology, it's one of the great challenges of our time, right? And it is all pervasive. But I suppose the comments I wanted to make, I suppose more reflecting, 30 years of working, in the public sector and looking at how these technologies can operate. And I suppose Data 61 and CSIRO, I suppose we are at the forefront of, implementing and looking at how we can use these complex technologies. And I suppose the first comment I wanted to make was just, there is a strong history of actually using data and using, the feedback of data, in the public sector, right? Over time, we've developed, a range of ways of doing that, both in compliance, risk-based decision making. So it's not that we come to it with no experience, but at the moment there's just an explosion both in the scale and the complexity of things we can do, and I think that's a very significant challenge, for us. But I think, like, if I reflect now, and I've probably been back, working very directly, through some of the really good initiatives and investments within at least the Australian government at the moment. But data quality is still a very, very significant issue for us. The issue, without, there are ethical problems, but I actually don't think there's a lot of people in government trying to be unethical. But there's probably a much bigger danger of actually just making mistakes, or actually not understanding your data. And so I think that's a fundamental challenge for us. And it's not another program in data cleaning and data cleansing, right? So I've seen 30 years of data cleansing. It is actually how you embed, how do we embed the efficient capture of, of data, and that's an important part. And you see that in all the places you see with AI. If it's complex to capture data, then nothing, you can't build AI, or you can't build good AI. So that's something that needs to be addressed. But efficient capture, it has to be driven in a cultural sense, right? It actually has to be, an agency has to become data driven, and I suppose all the people within the agency need to be data driven, right? People have got to, they've got to see the value of it, for their mission, for their purpose, right? Otherwise, it is just some impost and someone somewhere else said that they do it. And so there is a big challenge, I think, at all levels of agencies to become data driven. At the top level, to express the purpose of an agency, both in terms of its, in terms of the data and what you will see, and then through all of the people to actually understand the power of the data and how it can actually free them up to actually get better outcomes. I think, a related issue to that is, you often see a significant, there's still a divide between sort of the technology and our ability to do things with technology and the sort of policy and program parts, within the department. People see, everyone goes, well, you've got so much data, then there must be a way of exploiting it. It's the new oil. Please get some amazing insights. And it doesn't work, right? Well, sorry, look, there is value. There's value to be had there, but the big value is actually being able to frame the questions. And I think, as Alan said, the questions are at the core of all of this. If we frame the right questions and we can frame what we're trying to understand, then I think it makes it much more powerful. Then it's about building the solutions to the questions. Whereas a lot of the discussion at the moment is, I have so much data, it must be valuable, we must be able to get something from it. So it is actually, it's a journey, for an agency around that. Like, I think just my last couple of comments. I think it's just to reiterate that I know AI gets wrapped up with the ethical piece, and look, and you can see, like, across the tech sector, there are unethical things or things to my ethics that I think are unethical. But I still think the biggest danger that we have is actually just poor implementation, or misunderstanding it. To build good AI or to integrate that, and build a good society, within a government department, there are so many, different people that need to be involved. Right, the technology, right, it's a key part and it's a hard part, but there's a range of other things that need to be in there. And so, we need to continue training so more people understand what the technology can and can't do. And we need to make sure that all the people involved, you're not getting subsets of people generating technologies which are then implemented without everyone, the whole system understanding it. So I think they're the comments I'd like to make, David.
Thanks very much, Simon. Narelle, over to you to give us your opening thoughts.
Lovely, thank you, David. I just want to thank IPAA and ACOLA for organising this fantastic event. It's been a really big 18 months, I think, for us in the AI space for Australia. Looking at the AI ethics framework that Minister Andrews released, which was a Data 61 report that was done for us, we went away and looked at those ethics principles, had submissions, spoke to many groups to sort of see if we got the balance right, and then we released revised ethics principles at the end of last year. It was very much a collaborative process and something that we're actually currently having piloted at the moment by some of the large corporates. So there's been a lot going on in the AI ethics work. Also, Data 61 also did a roadmap for us on AI technologies, which identified 3 areas of focus, which were health and ageing and disability, cities and infrastructure, and natural resources and environment. And that report we worked very closely with Data 61 on, and I think it's given us some really good insights and some good policy thinking. We also just had, end of last year, the AI standards roadmap as well, which we're currently in the process of considering those recommendations. And then last year, Minister Andrews hosted the incredible AI summit that Genevieve, you were a part of, which brought together over 100 experts in AI to talk about AI and the opportunities. And the wonderful thing about the event was it was able to, it gave people an opportunity to see the opportunities that AI presented. So a lot's sort of been happening in that space. And then internationally, we've been part of G20, and we signed up to the OECD principles on AI ethics. And then just recently, Australia became a founding member of the Global Partnership on AI. And Genevieve, you're one of the leads for Australia in one of the working groups, which is terrific. And then only last week, we actually had a conversation with the US on AI and looking at collaboration. And a couple of weeks prior to that, we've been talking to the EU. So there is a lot going on. It feels like AI ethics and principles is very much sort of the focus, particularly internationally as well. So it's just great to be here and actually be able to have this conversation today. And for us, from where sitting in the department, we want to make sure that the ethic principles that we're developing give us that social license, that trust in terms of not only just from a government perspective, but also from a business perspective when they're thinking about AI too. So I'll just leave it there, David, and carry on.
Thanks, Narelle. Great. So I thought I'd kick things off with a bit of a combo. So I've got a question from Don from the Department of Home Affairs, which that I might then slightly elaborate on and then throw to the panel. So Don asks, what is the best approach to separating the reality from the hype? And when I was reflecting on all 3 of your opening remarks and Alan's comments too, there is a bit of a gap, isn't there, between how many people in society think about or understand AI and the related concepts of machine learning and algorithms, etc., and the discourse that occurs in fora such as this. And I'd be interested in each of your perspectives on, what is the way of increasing awareness and understanding that might then support taking greater control over our destiny, if you like, in the way in which you've all commented and Alan certainly challenged us. So Genevieve, I might go to you first and we'll just work our way across the panel.
So listen, I think one of the really interesting challenges we have is that AI was imagined long before it was built. And so the notion of the relationship between humans' ability to make a living thing that was like a human. We've got lots of stories about that, you know, Gollum, Frankenstein, the Terminator, and they never end well. So we have a long literary tradition of that. We also have a scientific tradition of talking about computers as though they were brains. So even before the kind of current wave back in the 1930s and 1940s, as people were building out the first computational machinery, they kept talking about it as being the brain. And so I think there's this really interesting way where for many of us, we were socialized into the idea of what AI would feel like long before we could possibly have encountered it. And we were socialized into it, well, through literature and science fiction and movies. And the thing about literature, science fiction and movies is they don't actually have to worry about, is there an instruction manual? Is it connected to the internet? Are you on mute? You know, they don't have to worry about any of those things. Things just work, usually flawlessly, unless it's British science fiction, in which case, you know, it's in a quarry and it only sometimes works, but it all still works, right? And I think for most of us, the reality is that the AIs we will encounter initially are nothing like the ones that science fiction taught us to be wary or excited about. If you're living in Canberra, for instance, and you commute down Northbourne Avenue, you're encountering AI every day. The public transportation system has a lightweight AI stack that is running such that that train controls the traffic lights, not anything else. It's already running a learning algorithm. If you're living in Sydney and you're in a big building, and at some point you get to go back into a lift, that lift is running AI. If you are using Netflix or Amazon or iView, you are encountering algorithms. If you're using a washing machine, you're encountering an algorithm. The reality is many of the technologies are already in our world. It's just they don't look the way we were taught to imagine them. So one of the challenges is how do we both respect that imagination, because it's what will power us to imagine and build other things, whilst scoping it appropriately and saying, actually, the stuff's already here. And as a result, it's already raising questions that we need to think about and already raising the challenges that we can imagine will get bigger and bigger. I mean, you know, the traffic lights on Northbourne Avenue here in Canberra had to have new signs put on them last year to let us know that they would now behave differently. They were the most delightfully opaque and oblique signs you've ever seen, because what they said was traffic signal may vary. It's a traffic light. You would hope the signal may vary. But what they were desperately trying to do was tell you this object that you have spent an entire lifetime with is now behaving differently. And for me, it's those smaller things that are actually the signs of the world that is coming. And the bigger challenge is how we learn to read those, not wait for the T1000.
Yeah. Narelle?
Need to pay more attention to the traffic lights on Northbourne Avenue.
I'm just a geek.
It's an interesting question, because I often think we talk sometimes, I wonder sometimes we talk about the AI, blockchain, whatever technology, we focus in on the word of that technology rather than just what it can do, the opportunities it presents. And I think sometimes we get caught up in the word. And like I also work on, I know this isn't a blockchain event, but, you know, I also work on blockchain, and it's the same thing. We get caught up in the language. And I think sometimes with AI, it's similar. So I think more we need to be focusing on the technology, what it can do, the outcomes, the benefits. And I think it's, you know, being able to put around that that trust for people, regardless of whatever technology it is. There is, you know, there is trust. There is that whatever we from a government perspective are doing, we have a framework in place, and like I said, those guardrails for its operation.
Simon?
I suppose a few comments. Like I suppose the hype around AI. Like, yeah, I still think. Yeah, say I'm reading a news article, you know, through Google, and you know, it might be about someone lost in the bush, and it'll start showing me ads for camping gear, you know, on the site, right? And it'll keep showing me those ads for, you know, 3 weeks or whatever. It's actually not that intelligent at all, right? It's quite amazing that it happens at scale, but there's also sort of no consequences. You know, I see it, I think it's silly, you know, but it's not consequences. Like I think in government, you know, you do start getting consequences. You know, consequences if things are wrong, and so I think you know there are a set of people who suddenly go AI, you know, it will change everything, and it will, right? But it's not magic, right? And it's still, you know, the rules of logic and inference still exist. So I still think it comes back to, you know, if you know anyone working in an agency or looking to use this sort of technology, it is about actually framing your question, right? So it is actually, what are the things you're trying to achieve, right? And that comes with its values, right? And it comes with, the consequences of getting those things wrong. And then I think it's just the same rational analysis we've had for 30 years around, well, what's a logical basis to do that? And then to some extent the AI or the ML, it's just efficient, right? We can do it at scale, we can do it consistently, we can systematise it. And so I think it's still approaching it that way rather than there's something magic and it's going to do something that you can't even conceive, because I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen a lot.
Okay. Narelle, we've got a question here which I'll throw to you first on, which is from someone called Anonymous, but they've asked an interesting question about what is unique about Australia's role in this. So you mentioned that you've been doing some work that's including a sort of international perspectives, and Genevieve, no doubt you'll have some observations on this as well. But Narelle, the question is, what's unique about Australia's role in development and deployment of responsible AI, despite Australia being likely to import more tech than it exports? How can we be a global leader and maximise the benefits to Australia?
So I think, to the point about us being more of an importer, I think that's true. In terms of what with any technology in Australia, we tend to be a technology taker. I think the unique position that we have in Australia is that we're actually able to look to overseas and actually learn from some of the work that's been going on overseas. We've seen, with the ethics principles, we've seen, the OECD and the G20 adopt very similar principles. And so then when we were coming through doing our work, we were able to sort of look at what work had been done overseas, follow models that have been done in the EU, but then also look at, okay, what are the cultural values for our country? Would these apply to us here? And I think what we've been able to do is sort of learn from overseas, but also apply it so that it is relevant to us and to our way of life. I think the thing for us is, and I think where we're really trying to head with the ethics work in particular is very much have that collaboration with the community, very much work at, when we did the AI ethics principles, we just didn't, accept the report from Data 61. We sort of thought, no, this is actually very much a community conversation, and we need to start having that conversation with businesses, technologists, academia, and we actually spent quite a bit of time. We took the 140 odd submissions on the ethics. We then locked basically probably about a group of 15 people in a room, and all of us had the same voice. So even me as a government representative, I had the same voice, same voice as someone else from the private sector. And over a period of months, we iterated on those ethic principles to the point that we all agreed. We couldn't leave the room until we actually agreed. And I think that made us very unique in terms of acceptance and having it piloted in terms of the ethics principles, piloted by some major corporates. So we've got Microsoft, we've got CBA, NAB, we've got some really big corporates piloting our ethics principles at the moment, which will give us some insights into, is it fit for purpose, is it working, and we're due to get some of that reporting on that early next month. So I think the uniqueness that we have is that we are taking the time, we are making it a full collaborative process, and we very much want community, business, government agencies, academia coming with us on that journey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Genevieve, Jacob Choi has built on this question by wondering.
Jacob Choi is a very, very naughty student of mine.
Very good. Well, he's deliberately asked this question then, which is it inevitable that Turing certificates branded on AI products or services will reflect local or national values? So it kind of goes to partly what Narelle was talking to about, can these things, of course, be culturally specific or etc. And would a Turing certificate issued in Australia have
Global
the same
infringement.
value or impact in China, for example.
Hello,
or the
Jacob.
US.
Listen, it's an interesting question. And one of the things we know is that even things like safety standards are different in different countries. Notions about braking distances, about seatbelts, about airbag expansion, all of those things actually turn out to be surprisingly more local than you might expect, as are ideas about what are appropriate levels of toxins in the environment and all kinds of things. So I think one of the challenges in imagining a global standard is whose value set do you enshrine and how does that get both enacted and then managed? And I think one of the challenges has often been when we think about localization strategies. So what happens when you bring a product to market in a different place? You end up having to manage not just the easy stuff, the voltage, the S's and the Z's, but also all kinds of other ideas. And I think one of the interesting challenges that Alan is putting there, and it's certainly been one that's being played out, I think, in both the OECD and the GPAA working group, is really how do we think about these conversations unfolding internationally and globally when there are, in fact, profoundly different cultural ideas at work here. And so how you navigate those and imagine that there will always be different ideas about safety and regulation and trust even are for me really striking. I mean, even what we would consider to be trusted in the United States versus Australia are quite different locuses of attention and effort. And so the idea about saying what does it mean to certify an AI object as trustworthy seems like a glorious idea. The devil will be in the proverbial details in that one.
Genevieve, just taking you to the question of you've come back to Australia to do what you're doing.
I have.
What's special about Australia? What's Australia's special contribution potentially to
the answer
debates?
And the answer can't be coffee, can it? It's a shame. I wish it could be coffee. Listen, for me, there were a couple of things that propelled me out of Silicon Valley. One was that I had a bit of yeets in the back of my head that the Centre couldn't hold, and that one of the things about being in Silicon Valley is that it is a self-reinforcing discourse and it's very hard to step outside of it. And it can be a little small for a very big place. And so part of what Australia had was that notion of being a little bit sideways from those conversations, so it wasn't held hostage to some of the same forces, Blaney's tyranny of distance working in the other direction. But part of it is also that Australia has a really long history that we don't always tell ourselves very effectively about considered responses to social transformation and change, and of making new legislative forms and being incredibly brave in the face of things. And we don't tell our history to ourselves that way in some ways, but if we think about everything from Medicare to the first freeing up of higher education in the 1970s, to where we have been on environmental standards, to what we did with things like the Crawford Report on Law Reform in the 1980s, to what we've done around sustainability in the last 10 years, we may never feel like we're good enough, because as Australians, I think there is a constitutional bias into imagining we'll never be good enough. But we have actually been a place that has been willing to have conversations that were hard conversations, and willing to have it not be government versus all the other sectors, but creating consultations like Narelle is talking about. And when I talk to my colleagues in other parts of the world, they're always really struck by the nature of those consultations and the kind of questions we open up and the ways in which we play those things out. And things that we wouldn't always regard as national treasures are seen by others as such. So whether it is CSIRO, whether it is our climate data, whether it's in fact our epidemiological response and the data that we have sitting underneath of that and the ways we think about public health, those are seen globally as things that are incredible assets here, that are places that we can build on.
Simon, Data 61, of course, sits at the heart of a lot of the research and thinking about applying the use of AI, as well as further developing the research itself. How's Data 61 thinking about the sort of areas of strength that Australia can focus on and deepen in those areas around research and application of these technologies?
I still think it comes, like I think we have got strong researchers, but I'd actually take the question back to, what are our questions, right? And that comes down to, like CSIRO as an Australian research agency but we focus on, large challenges, and a lot of those in Australia, but we have global, aspirations as a way of scaling out technology. I still think from the roadmap report, I think it's picked out, areas of automation in areas such as agriculture. There's sustainability in the environment. I think there's things we can we can do there. I think I think just in around government, I think government, right, is a key area as well, right, in terms of actually how we can build a better society, and how we can actually look at better service delivery. We can look at just efficiency through the system. So I think that's really important. So I think in terms of doing that, I think we have some very good computer vision. We've got robotics, a lot of it focused through Sydney into Queensland. I think just machine learning. We've got good pockets of machine learning, but again, I think we need to look at how we grow that capability, and I think it's like throughout. You see the pattern in a lot of places, but how do we connect it up? We tend to be, we have lots of isolated pieces and lots of, how many centres for machine learning are there? We need to get a national, a more national connected up view, right? In terms of I suppose what the national challenges are, and then I suppose how we actually, how do we arrange ourselves to do that? And that's definitely not, CSIRO's not the person to lead that, right? There's too many challenges. There's too many different things to do, but. We definitely want to try and get more engaged in trying to solve challenges.
I also wouldn't want to undercall in Australia just how much effort we have in research and application on the humanities and social sciences side of the equation. When we talk about AI, we often end up having conversations about the STEM side, but the reality is in Australia between kind of computational data science, but also all of the work that's been going on in the digital humanities, all of the work that gets done in places like philosophy, economics, psychology, but also into the, classic arts and humanities are also all places that are pushing the conversation along in terms of what you do, how to think about data sets, how to think about algorithms, how to think about trustworthiness and fairness. Those are not just conversations that are in some ways held inside STEM. And one of Australia's other advantages here is that we actually have an incredibly highly respected and really good humanities and social sciences tradition. And that's actually part and parcel of what we bring to these conversations is that we have real expertise in those dimensions. Yeah,
and I think that's an area, just the whole issue of responsible technology. And I think that's somewhere where, so we've got technical strengths and you need, if you want to do AI, you need technical components, but AI is not just the technical components, like it's all of those pieces.
Well, this is when we're going to have a disciplinary argument, because I'm going to say actually philosophy is deeply technical, so is anthropology just
wrong technical.
Yes, wrong technical.
Just to Simon's point, so a couple of months ago, Minister Andrews hosted digital economy ministers from the states and territories. And one of the outcomes of that meeting was we're actually doing exactly that at the moment. We're mapping all of the work that's going on across Australia. So, we know that, Adelaide University has its work around the AI Centre, Queensland are doing particular work, Melbourne, everybody's doing something. So we're trying to get a bit of a sense of what is the landscape across the country, who's specialising in what, and then where are the gaps. So that's a piece of work that we're undertaking in the department at the moment. It's actually being led by the South Australians, which is fantastic, and we hopefully have that, I think, towards the end of the year, which will give us a sense of a bit of a gap analysis and the opportunities as well.
Genevieve, given the inherently multidisciplinary nature of many of the questions that we're unpacking today, can you say a little bit about what forms of leadership might be needed to tackle some of these things? Clearly, I might go to you next, Narelle, and ask you about what forms of leadership does the government think it should be playing, but effectively leadership can come from lots of places, and we're talking multidisciplinary. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. For me, it's about a couple of different pieces. I think we need to be more invested in giving people a systems point of view. Like one of the challenges when we talk about AI is people end up focusing on just a little tiny bit of the puzzle, the data set, the ML, the underlying maths, as opposed to saying it, which is where Simon rightly keeps taking it. What is the question that we are attempting to answer, and more importantly, why? And in whose interest is that question? And to be able to take that kind of broad perspective requires an ability to think about things as a system and to think about all the pieces that move in that system, because it isn't often just about the technology. It's also about the regulation. It's also about the social actors. It's about the government. And for me, having leaders who are capable of thinking at a systems level and seeing the full dimensions of the system is important. I think it is useful to have people who've been exposed to lots of different ways of thinking. So I tend to believe it's good to have been trained in one discipline, but it's good to have been exposed to others. So a little bit of broad-based thinking. Norbert Wiener, a man who arguably is another one of the grandfathers of AI, many, many years ago wrote that he thought in the future the poets would need to be engineers or the engineers would need to be poets. And I'm inclined to think he meant that as an and, not an or, certainly today. But I think about how do you have leaders that are well balanced that way? And then I think, unsurprisingly, given my experiences in Silicon Valley, I think you also have to have a leadership cohort who are willing to bring a range of incredibly diverse voices into the room and find a way to hold them in conversation. And we spend a lot of time talking about the value of diversity. We don't spend a lot of time talking about what it actually means to make that function well. So it's the piece that says diversity, yes, but unless you've worked out how to do inclusion and create a sense of belonging for other people, it really doesn't help. And the reality is if we want to find meaningful solutions here, we're going to have voices and experiences in the room that don't sit comfortably together, and creating the room for the discord and for the disharmony and letting that exist for a little while, because resolving it quickly doesn't actually fix the problem, is an interesting piece of the puzzle for me about leaders who are willing to basically make room for different voices and find ways through. So it's a high bar.
Yeah. So Narelle, just your thoughts on this theme of leadership and the way in which you might be positioning the work that you're doing to draw out leadership from others as well, and how you're seeing that pan out.
So very much, and I can talk from the department's point of view, we probably about 2 years ago, established an interdepartmental committee at the Deputy Secretary's level around AI. And I have to say, I mean, David, you've probably got a lot of IDCs. This probably had about 35 people. It was the biggest IDC I had seen just to discuss AI, which was fantastic. And, often when you go to an IDC, they drop off after a while, the numbers, but the numbers actually always remained high. So I think right across the bureaucracy, there's real excitement and opportunity around AI. Admittedly, with COVID, we've sort of put on hold the IDC, but we've very much tried to, as a department, facilitate and coordinate that role around AI and AI policy development. We've just established a community of practice around AI ethics as well, and getting other government agencies in that space. Because it's, like I've said, we've done an enormous amount of work in this space, and we really want to get that buy-in with other government agencies. And I think the other thing around leadership is the Global Partnership on AI. So, we are a founding member of that, and the government signed up to that. And the great thing about that is it's got various working groups, and it's not me as a bureaucrat sitting on that. It's actually people who know this stuff, like yourself, Genevieve, and other experts from other universities who are actually Australia's representatives and who are there in those conversations around responsible AI. And I think very much to the conversations we're having internationally and the learnings we're getting working with international counterparts is really bringing a lot for us that we can bring back to those community practices and IDCs and meetings such as that. So we're really excited about this space, and very much enjoy working with all the government agencies, and it's very much on all of us to be a part of the conversation.
And Simon, similarly to you, just on this idea of leadership, how do you see good examples of leadership, if you like, in this space, coming from other parts of the ecosystem, if you like, so not necessarily from government, they could be coming from academia, from the private sector. What are your thoughts on this?
I still think I was actually quite taken by Genevieve's comment, right? Because it is about bringing all the people to the table, right? So I think it is actually it needs to be the bigger vision, right? So there's lots of people with a singular vision or a singular idea that is being prosecuted, but I think it is actually understanding, having the vision for it. And I think it sort of speaks to some of our questions previously around, how you balance, having a vision and strategy around, what technology is going to spill into Australia, and actually how might you facilitate that, and so that's a question we think about a lot, which is actually, there's all this development and R&D gone in. It hasn't come to Australia. Why hasn't it? Is there a way we can help that come, right? And then there's actually what you might need to generate yourself, or sort of do in a bespoke sort of way. And so I think that's a key thing you need to look at. I think it is, and it's taking the bigger picture, right? So something like, particular technologies come and become the buzzword. I think you've got to have a longer term view about what you're reacting to and what your strategies are. And I think, you see, in parts of ag tech and other parts in Australia, you'll see people coming through with that vision. So I think it's being more mature about, how what we do fits into that well.
Genevieve, I attended a similar forum as this a few days ago, in which your Vice Chancellor, Brian Schmidt, was talking about the way in which his vision is for the university to take further steps down the path of engaging into the policy world, and to be more enmeshed in that. I'm curious about your perspective on that. I mean, of course, feel free to completely disagree with Brian if you wish, but how you see that happening, and the ways in which, on both sides, if you like, we can make it easier for those connections and those dialogues to occur.
Such a good question. One of the really interesting responsibilities of being at the National University is that it's not just about chasing the other sandstones, right? I mean, the ANU was funded on a distinctive promise and a distinctive premise, Nugget, Coombs and Chifley, basically saying we needed to build a cohort of smart Australians who could help make Australia better. I mean, it was about solving big problems in the service of the nation as imagined in 1946, 1947. So there were a pretty distinctive set of problems back then. But the idea wasn't to build another university, right, that was like all the others. It was about how did you identify, tackle, and make sure that the solutions you built found implementation of the hardest problems facing our country. Back in the 40s, that was a very particular set of challenges. Some of them remain. How do we build a fair and equitable society? How do we think about what it means to have a functioning economy? How do we make sure that we have a medical landscape in which we're all healthy? How do we think about our place in the Pacific? I mean, those challenges haven't changed. I think, Brian would probably add to that in the 21st century, we need to be deeply concerned about climate change and sustainability, that we are more than 200 years a settler country and never fully resolved our relationships with the original occupants and owners of this place, and that we need to find a way to build a world that we all want to live in. And he would articulate those as the big problems. And I think for the National University, our responsibility then is to make sure that we are both finding ways to be in that conversation, drive it, where not everyone else wants to necessarily have that conversation. So one of the things that we might all know about being a leader is that sometimes you're uncomfortably out ahead of the rest of the world, waiting, hoping that you are creating a path where people will follow. But for me, that means articulating the problem effectively, finding as many different voices into that problem as possible, and bringing as many people along on that journey as possible. So for me, that means that a university shouldn't just be a place people come to get degrees. It should be a place out of which knowledge continuously flows. Knowledge and insights, and it should be about making it a place that is comfortable for people who aren't just there for degrees and who aren't just there for doing research. It should be about influencing policy, but also helping shape and guide national conversations. It should be about sparking debate. It should sometimes be about being wrong, because I think not all ideas find their right time and their right purpose, and there should be room for that too. But what that means in terms of how you engage with government, I'd hope it wasn't just national. I think it should be state too. One of the most unexpectedly powerful consequences of the pandemic has surely been the National Cabinet and of finding ways to start rewriting our federal-state relationships. So I think a university that's engaged with all levels of government feels like a good thing. I hope it's a place that government is comfortable coming and a place where we are comfortable in discussion. But I also hope those aren't comfortable discussions, because I don't think they should be. I don't think you get change by saying the same thing over and over again. I think you actually have to have moments where you allow there to be lots of different voices.
So, Narelle, how are you setting up those uncomfortable conversations then?
I'm sorry, Narelle, that's really not the right bridge for you. Terrible thing.
Look, I think, I mean, we've got an excellent relationship with the ANU. Brian sits on the Minister's National Science and Technology Council, so do you, Genevieve. And I think we get great conversations around technology and science in those meetings. I think for us, you know, we very much as a department, very much plugged into the universities, very much into the learnings of those universities and the strengths as well. And I think, you know, like I've sort of spoken before about the way we've done consultation, it's very much around getting academia in the room. And I remember when we went through the ethics work, you know, having a professor of law sitting in the room arguing with us on ethics, and just her perspective was so completely different to sort of the data scientist expert. And it's, I think, giving everyone an opportunity to be involved in those unique conversations and having a voice and bringing their insights. That's the real value we get from the department, especially from my division as well.
Simon, I want to go to something a little more specific. We got a question around AI in the legal system, and the question came from Arun at IBM, and his question was: will AI play a role in our judicial system? Will it replace the consciousness of lawyers, judges, and jurors? Now, I know there has been some work been going on within Data 61 around RegTech in particular, which is related to this question, although not quite the same. But have you got any observations about that sort of thing? Because this idea about AI moving into these sorts of spaces relates to all sorts of things that people muse about with AI, including, like, you know, will the AI driving the car take out the grandparents or the children on the side of the road,
the trolley problem.
Any reflections on that?
Yeah, like I think there's been a lot of controversy in the US around the use of, the use of AI, but it's actually undisclosed, I think, you know, in terms of actually how it's working. And I think, you know, obviously, you know, any system relies on the data that goes into it. It relies on the processes that generate that data, you know, and the interaction of how you actually process that data to come to decisions, right? And so, you know, there's some pretty serious things you need to have control of to make that work. So I think you need to have control of it. I still think the legal one is interesting in the sense that if you said to someone, you know, like, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll probably get the description not 100% correct, but imagine you're a lawyer and they hear a case, and imagine they could have a system which then got all the cases that were similar to that case. Now, there's a big question there about what is similar, but imagine you could do that, and then it could return those cases and summarise what the outcomes were from all the judges who saw those other cases. Now, to some extent, if the judge actually went and did that by hand and took the books off and read those, we'd actually say it's a very diligent judge. Whereas if a computer system, you know, actually did that process for it and put it in front of the judge, you know, then is that still diligent? And so, to some extent, like, you know, I'd hope in a society that, you know, that there's an opportunity there at least, you know, to make sure that, you know, we can, you know, that brings consistency. It lets people access information and summarise it in a way. And so I think that's potentially a good outcome. But at the end of the day, the judge would need to, well, my personal view is the judge needs to make the decision, right? That's a summary, you know, that's a summary of information. But then there's things that aren't in that summary that the judge will know from the case, and there'll be other circumstances which aren't in that information. So I'd never say you just get here's what it is and go, well, this seems like an average case, I'll give you the average. Right, I think it's beyond that now, but that comes to the human part, which is if a judge is actually getting this summary, do they actually go, I'm feeling a bit tired this afternoon? Now, look, a judge would never operate in that way. My apologies to the judges, but again, if you're providing that, again, there's a whole psychological issues with, do you start to believe it? Is that the AI? And then it could just be there's already strong evidence from the data that at different times of the day, judges operate in different, there are patterns in it, let's say. And so, again, you actually have to think, summarising the data, that seems great. But on the other hand, once you actually do that, what is actually the outcome that comes from it? And then you've got the feedback mechanism there, right? So if there is an issue in terms of how they're interpreting that, and that's changing how they behave, that's now feeding back into the data, and that will feed back again. And I think that's where it gets much more complex in terms of how we embed these things. So I'd never sometimes this debate can go to the very end that all data, that data, you just can't trust it almost. And I think that's anti-intellectual, right? The data is really important, right? Points of truth about the world, but we've actually got to be very careful about how we implement it. So I think for Arun, I think we could look at how we analysing that data, collecting it systematically, and having it in ways that is that we can search and use is important for judges, but it's important for our society. But exactly how you'd implement it, I think you'd have to think of all those things I've thought of, and I think there'd be others as well.
Come on, Genevieve, I know you've thought a lot about this, and whether it's in the legal system or automated decision making in general. What are your reflections on these things?
Well, I think you have to go back to the place that Simon and Alan started, which is, why are you automating the decision in the first place? So question number one is, why is this the set of decisions that need to be automated? In the case that Simon's referring to in the United States, that's in the state of Florida, they were using a sentencing guideline tool that was an algorithm that basically was designed to speed up the time between you had sentenced someone and you rendered a judgment on how long they should be sentenced for. There was a tool because the judges were taking too long. So it was a classic efficiency play. And, there are questions you might want to ask there about, does automating justice in that sense make sense, or might you want to think about caseload for judges? Like, because there's multiple sort of things of thinking about, why is this, for me, sort of first principles are, why is the decision being automated? What's the kind of the notion that this decision needs to be automated, and in whose interests does the automation serve, right? So there's sort of that piece. I think there's often a piece, and again, Simon's highlighted that, of what do we think the actual decision even is that we imagine automating, right? So what's the decision itself? I think there are pieces about what are the consequences. We certainly know from lots of social science research that humans will believe a system's response more than they'll believe a human, so they're willing to trust the system. So if the system tells them things, they will enact that. We've seen that for multiple years of multiple studies. So there's multiple kind of layers there, right? And then it is incredibly easy to fall for a kind of notion that more data equals more truth, as opposed to imagining that more data just equals more data. And the mechanisms by which that data were collected are themselves already implicated inside incredibly complicated social, cultural, historical, political, and economic forces. And then in the legal case, the one that always I end up thinking about is that I can imagine that having a machine learning tool help you read contract documents, a thing where there is a relatively straightforward format and a relatively straightforward and agreed to set of languages, I can see there's an efficiency there.
Yeah.
Imagining that some of the most important decisions of my lifetime in this country had to do with judges who broke precedent, which is, of course, what data would give you, would be precedent, would be legal precedent. If you think about some of the most important decisions in Australia in the last 40 years, they have to do with breaking precedent. Hello, the Mabo case. That was a judge who didn't follow what the law had been decided up until now. And if you imagine giving up the ability of a judge to say the world has changed, the data may once have said that, but it doesn't anymore, feels like a kind of process that I would be deeply uncomfortable with, both here and in other places, right? I think about judges that have gone against decades of convention Brown versus the state of Georgia in the United States, which desegregated schools, Mabo here. There's lots of times when judges didn't do what the data told them they should do. And so it's a balance, right? There've also been judges who have done things completely immorally by not following what the data suggested that are equally problematic. So I don't know how you quite solve that problem, but for me, the ability to imagine that data, which is always historic, always retrospective, and always the past, shouldn't always be our future.
Thank you. Now, we're getting towards the end of our session, and in a moment I'm going to ask each of you just to sum up in 10 to 20 words a key thought you'd like to leave with your audience. But while you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask you one last other question, which is, Narelle, you did mention the word COVID before, and we did have a question from the audience from Rishi at IPAA Australia, which was related to COVID. And you can't really have a conversation about anything at the moment without having some connection to COVID. So the question was, how do you think COVID-19 will impact on the development, adoption and experience of AI given the current economic environment?
It's an excellent question. So interestingly, the meeting that we had last week with the US, they were talking to us about the vast amounts of research that are out there at the moment in relation to COVID and vaccines. And what they've had to do is get ML and just run it right across the research because they don't have time to, at the moment, read all the research that's out there. So I think that's a positive story, and sort of if it can help speed up us defining a vaccine, it's a great news story. I think if anything, it makes us realise the importance of I think I'm trying to think about it from a health perspective. I think it really does focus AI and health and the benefits that it can have. And I think with anything, I think with COVID, it might bring out those opportunities, the benefits, but like I've said before too, any gaps or where we might have to think we need, from a government perspective, where we might need to do more work as well. If anything, from my perspective, from a policy, it's probably given us a little bit of time to have a bit of a think about what we're doing in this space as well. But definitely feeling the pressure ramping back up that we actually need to crack on and finalise the principles that we're trying to do at the moment, get some guidance out to businesses around AI. So it's all about those principles. It's all about sort of for us now, sort of thinking about the sequencing of the next lot of work that we need to do.
Great. Okay, Simon, any thoughts on COVID?
I think beyond the health, the direct health pieces, it's obviously a huge shock to our economy and a huge shock internationally. I think I think in the short term, I think it's trying to understand how that world will change. And obviously data has a part of that, but I think at the end of the day, human cognition, I think will outcompete it, in most circumstances. But I think it will drive efficient. There'll again be the need for efficiency, and again, I think looking at how we can grow the economy again through exports. And so I think it is actually driving the efficiency agenda, and so some of that's sort of digital transformation, just as it's sold as a service now. But part of that actually will be looking at the new things you can do. And I think AI has got a place to play in there. But again, this touches on where's that a positive place aligned with our values, and where's it not. And the vast majority of cases will be aligned to our values. So I think we've got to look at that. And I think it's thinking, where are our opportunities to produce new digital exports, right? And I think at least some of the discussion before, people seeing that we can make like a shrink-wrapped ethical AI and people will buy this thing, whereas I think it's going to be more diverse than that, and some of it's just ideas. So I think there's a lot of things to be done there. Again, manufacturing, right? So looking at trying to get analysing our sovereign manufacturing capability. And again, AI is a huge part, of sort of high-tech manufacturing. So I think there's a range of things.
Genevieve, I'm going to double your challenge. Anything on COVID and any final reflections?
Okay, I'm also thinking that Rishi is one of my graduates. They're doing well. So the COVID piece, I think the most interesting pieces about it are actually things that started during the bushfire. sort of the bushfire season for Australia. I think one of the things that the last 9 months has made incredibly clear is that a whole lot of infrastructures of the 21st century are built on infrastructures of the 20th century, and we've suddenly had to see both the resilience and brittleness of those infrastructures, whether that was electricity, telecommunications, our various other kinds of networks, as well as our civic and civil society. I think Australia has been well tested over the last 9 months in lots of different ways. And I think those things are relevant to AI, because we can talk about AI in isolation, but the reality is it does need some really banal things like electricity and telecommunications networks and data. So there's sort of that piece. And then I think for people who build algorithms and worry about data, the last 3 to 4 months have generated a tranche of data that is significantly different than everything that came before it in terms of people's behaviours and patterns of behaviour, and how we think about whether that resets a whole series of algorithms that drive taste and preference and behaviour is an interesting challenge. And then Narelle's absolutely right. Some of the most interesting stuff that's been going on inside the use of AI in COVID's actually being around how do we use machine learning in particular and deep learning to really look at the incredible amount of medical data that's being produced and analyze it effectively. So whether that's, you know, Anthony Townsend and Jeremy Howard at Kaggle in San Francisco, so 2 Australians off helping drive that stuff, or whether it's people like John Fraser at UQ who's working out how would you use AI to do real-time analytics on data for emergency admissions into ICUs using all the data of the world's patients. Those are places where that stuff is really interesting. One thought to leave people with: I'm still building a new branch of engineering an hour and a half later. I'm still building a new branch of engineering. It's still at the ANU, and I'm still looking for students.
Actually, I think that might be a good place to bring things to a close today. Can I firstly, though, thank each of you, Simon, Narelle, and Genevieve, for your wonderful contributions. I can assure you, audience, that they will shortly be presented with some marvellous chocolates from the local Canberra chocolaterie, Jasper and Myrtle, but they're not going to be now. So we will do that in a moment. Thank you. But I did just want to say what a terrific conversation this has been, and really just reflecting on Alan's comments earlier. About how we might want to shape our own future, and a lot of that's come through in the discussion today. Just reflecting on the fact that we've got, an audience of it'll be mostly public servants. So my challenge to all of you in the audience is to be reflecting on, of course, how can you make your mark on the themes that we've discussed today? What broad-based ways of thinking can you bring to the public policy challenges and delivery challenges that you're working on? How can you bring a greater level of literacy in your teams around AI so that you can be more effective? You know, are you an engineer or a poet, or both? Hopefully both. And how can you also bring a diversity of perspectives and cultural backgrounds and expertise to bear on the problems or the opportunities that you're seeking to address. So with that, I'll say thanks again to our speakers today. Thanks to ACOLA and to IPAA, and tune in next time for another exciting instalment of IPAA Online. Thank you.